social studies teacher at Quest Academy, an independent gifted school in Palatine, Illinois. We are very, very fortunate and pleased to have Robin Talley, author of Lies We Tell Ourselves, joining us to talk about that particular book, of which most of these girls have read and are doing an independent reading project, a podcast for an independent reading project. So we're very, very honored and blessed to have Ms. Talley with us, and we'll take it away.
Great.
Okay, first question. Okay, so first thing that came to mind when we were thinking of questions to ask you is we wanted to know what inspired you to write about this topic, write this book.
Totally. Drew, do you want to mute your audio or?
Yeah, we'll do. What am I doing here?
Great. All right, so now I can't hear you guys, so just FYI, but if your audio is on, then my audio is coming out double to you guys, so just wanted to go ahead and mute that. But so as for how I got the idea for Lies We Tell Ourselves, so the idea for that book actually came from my parents. They were both in high school in Virginia in the 1960s, and they're both white, and they were both in school when their schools were being integrated for the first time. And so they were telling me about that experience, and it was actually a few years ago when we were on a road trip together, and they were telling me about how their parents had been afraid that their schools might shut down due to the school integration efforts that were going on. And I thought, well, that's strange. Why would their parents have been worried about the schools shutting down? Like, I'd never heard about any schools shutting down or school desegregation, and that seemed very weird to me. So I Googled it, and I discovered that, in fact, in Virginia, there had been a huge crisis in 1959 over school desegregation, and a number of schools were, in fact, shut down. In fact, there was one school district where the schools were shut for 5 entire years. There was no public school in that school district for 5 entire years because the Virginia state legislators and local legislators were that committed to preventing integration. They cared that strongly about Black and white students not going to school together. They're willing to shut down the entire school so that no one could go to school for long periods of time in order to prevent it. And I thought, well, that's really quite incredible, and I can't believe that I never knew that before. I mean, I grew up in Virginia, I went to public schools, I took history class, but that had never been covered. And I was very intrigued to learn more about this, and I started reading up on it. And I thought, as I was reading this, I was like, this would be a really interesting subject to explore in a young adult novel, because this is very much a historical event in which teenagers were on the front lines of an advocacy effort, and that the adults are usually the ones who get the credit for so much advocacy that's happened, but this was a case where it was really teenagers who were doing the work, and I thought that'd be really interesting to explore. But at the same time, I was thinking, well, what if I was writing a story about a girl who was on the front lines of this incredibly public-facing civil rights movement, but at the same time, she was dealing with a much more private struggle, which was being gay. Because in the 1950s, if you were gay, there was no such thing as being an out gay teenager. That just didn't exist. Being gay necessarily meant being in the closet, and it meant suffering a lot. And so I thought it'd be really interesting to write about somebody who was struggling with something really public-facing, like school integration, while at the same time dealing with a really private struggle, which being gay would have to be.
Okay, so another question we have is, what research did you do to know about this topic before writing? So did you do any research?
Yeah, I did a lot of research. No need again?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So yes, before I started writing, I actually did 3 months of research before I wrote a single word of Lies We Tell Ourselves. I went into it knowing a little bit about school integration, what I learned in school and what I gathered over the years, but I didn't know anything like the kind of depth that I needed to know in order to write this story. I had to really immerse myself in research in order to write this book. So the most useful thing for me, I did a lot of different kinds of research, but the most useful thing was reading memoirs. A lot of the students who experienced integration wrote their stories down. And if you look at the author's note at the back of the book, I listed out a lot of those memoirs, many of which are really fascinating, and I highly encourage them. I highly encourage reading them. But so I learned a lot about what students went through in Little Rock, Arkansas, which is the best known case of school integration in the US. So a lot of those students wrote down their memoirs. And there were some memoirs from Virginia as well, which is not as well known, but had its own story. And so I read a lot of memoirs, I read a lot of oral histories and listened to interviews and video interviews from students who went through it. And I also needed to know just about, in addition to knowing the intricacies of how the school integration movement worked, I needed to know just what life was like in the 1950s in Virginia if you were in high school. Because there's like sitcoms, movies from that era, but they're not often accurate reflections. So I also read a lot of just day-to-day teen life material from that era. And I spent a lot of time at my local library looking at yearbooks, which was fascinating. My local library was able to get me yearbooks from like the late 50s and the early 60s. And so I was able to go through those and like look at what people looked like. Everyone had the exact same hairstyle. It was really, really different than today. There were like huge spreads and devoted to the varsity football team and the varsity cheerleading squad, and just pages and pages about all of this. And there were also like, I got to read the signatures at the back that people had signed in the 50s, the people who had signed each other's yearbooks. And today people write funny, witty things in yearbooks. They didn't do that in the 50s. All of the signatures were like, "You're such a nice girl," like, and that was it. And then they'd sign their name. They didn't do smiley faces or anything. So it was different, but it was really, really interesting. So the research was very much integral to the writing process on this book.
So considering the topic, the fact that it was about integration, about a gay relationship, was it hard for you to get published considering that,
Sure. No, it wasn't. I didn't encounter anyone saying, we don't feel comfortable publishing a book on this topic. I think that publishing overall, especially young adult publishing, has come a long way in terms of representing folks from different backgrounds. There is still a very, very long way to go. We still need to have a lot more representation for LGBT characters, as well as characters of color and characters from other marginalized groups. But I think that there's a lot less resistance than there might once have been in the publishing world to getting those stories out there. And so it's just a matter of like really supporting the authors writing these kinds of stories and supporting marginalized authors to get their work in front of publishers and get publishers in a position to go ahead and acquire and publish that stuff and promote it widely as well.
So at the end of the book, why did you decide to have Ruth understand what was going on between Linda and Sarah?
That's a good question. I think I thought it would be interesting to sort of get out of Linda and Sarah's heads for a bit and sort of see what they looked like to the outside world. And I thought Ruth was a character that I really wanted to explore. Ruth is one of my favorite characters, if that wasn't clear from the book. I was really interested in her journey particularly, and because she had her own arc within the story as well. And I wanted to show a little bit about what she was thinking and to show that she was maturing a lot over the course of these experiences, just like Linda and Sarah were, to sort of show how she felt that path had been going.
I'm going to interrupt real quick because I'd like to ask, do you have the possibility of continuing that story further?
No, I don't think so. I think that's a standalone. Yeah.
Okay.
So initially when Sarah decided that she wanted to join the movement and go to Jefferson was because at her other school, they lacked the resources because they didn't get the funding that all white schools got. So after Sarah realized that she was put in like remedial classes and was going to be placed like way below what she had at the other school, like why didn't you have her seriously consider maybe dropping out or leaving Jefferson?
Well, so that was a really complicated thing. Over the history of the integration movement, these kids were generally integrated in very small numbers. So in this case, this is fictional representation. There were just 10 students at the school. So if Sarah had left, there would have been 10% of the Black population of the school would not have been there, would not have been representing, it would not have been, standing up every single day. So that would have been a really big step, and that would have been a setback. Now everybody has to make their own decisions, and there were students on the front lines of integration who did ultimately decide to leave the schools that they had been placed in and go back to their previous schools, and that was, everybody had to make their own decision on that. But as for Sarah, I think that, well, first of all, she probably didn't even feel like she had a choice. But even if she had, I don't think she would have left because I think she felt that what she was doing there was important enough that she needed that it was bigger than her by herself. Okay. I can't hear us, sorry. I don't have the audio, sorry.
The teachers and the administration, you know, it struck me because that's something in teaching history, I hadn't really thought about, is how they would handle it or how they would act toward them. Is that the way they really talked to them? And did you feel like anybody was sympathetic to them?
Was sympathetic to the teachers, you mean, or was anybody sympathetic to the students?
That said that any teachers in that school would be sympathetic toward or help the Black characters?
Yeah, I think that there's one teacher in the book who I think is sympathetic to them, Mr. Lewis, the choir teacher, who tries to help. It's a tricky thing to look at, like, what the teachers were doing and what the teachers thought, because you see different reactions, you see different interpretations of that when you look at the history from different people. When I talked to my mother about this, about like her memories of when her school was integrated, she said she read the book, you know, she read Lies We Tell Ourselves. It was my first book. She was very excited to read it. But she said, like, listen, my teachers were not like that at all. They would never have talked to the students that way, and it would just not, they were, you know, very fair and very even-minded. And so I think that it really varies from school to school and case to case. But if you read the memoirs of the Black students who experienced it, most of what you see about their experience with the teachers was not positive. If the teachers said anything at all to them, particularly, it was usually not in a positive way. There was one case, I think it was a girl in Little Rock, who said that she was watching the TV news one night, the night before she was going to go to school. Now I can't remember if this was Little Rock or a different city, but she was watching the TV news the night before she was going to go to school, and she saw a man on the TV news speaking out against integration and saying that integration was wrong and he didn't want integration. And the next day she showed up to school and he was one of her teachers. So that was the environment that a lot of these kids were experiencing. So definitely varied from place to place. But I think that in a lot of cases, the kids were not getting the help that they should have gotten from the teachers and the administrators and the other adults in the school environment.
What did you want us to, like, take from the book, from your book? Like, what was the overlaying message of your book?
I think. Sorry?
Go ahead.
I think it would totally depend on everybody's, you know, every reader brings their own interpretation to a book and will have their own reaction to it and their own thing that they take away. So that's a tough question to answer, because I don't want to tell anybody how to read it or tell them what they should get out of it particularly. But I think that for me, it, you know, really comes down to just thinking about our history and remembering what's happened in the past. And just because it is in the past doesn't mean that it's not relevant to our lives, and making sure that we're conscious of it at all times. And especially right now with everything that we're seeing happening in the news and everywhere else, a lot of history is repeating itself and is shaping up to repeat itself more and more. And so I think the key thing for me in thinking about all this is to remember what's happened in the past, and to educate people about what's happened in the past and make sure that it doesn't happen again.
So with everything that was, no, never mind. Oh, okay, sorry. With like everything that was being thrown at Sarah, you know, all those kids, all the negative comments, how do you think that she was able to deal with all that? Like, did she have a strong mind, or was God her biggest supporter, or her parents, or the fact that she didn't want to let everybody down? You know?
Yes. all of those, I think, is the answer. I think it was a lot. You know, she had to draw on everything that she had in order to make it through this experience. And so I think everything that you just mentioned was essential to her, like, you know, holding together and making it through. I think a lot of people would not, I would certainly not have been able to make it through. I think she's incredible what she pulled off.
I'm interested in the character of Linda. One, and maybe I missed it, what was it that made it so her father didn't pay attention to her very much?
So what was motivating her father, you mean?
Yeah.
I think that Linda's father is just a terrible human being, basically. This is really funny because I can't hear you guys, so I can see you laughing, and it's like I have this string. Yeah, see, the more dramatically you laugh, exactly, like wave your hands and stuff, and you'll get the idea across to me. Exactly, thank you. This is awesome. But yeah, so I think that Linda's father is basically just a horrible, horrible person who is of the mold of which we, especially used to see a lot of people, and we still do see a lot of people who can see things only through their own personal lens and can't consider what other people are thinking and don't think it's relevant to think about other people's perspectives. It's a common theme that we see among oppressors of all stripes. In his case, he's a journalist, sort of. He calls himself a journalist. But we see it in politicians, other authority figures as well in a lot of cases.
Well,
Linda's father was a terrible person, and I just want to know what made Linda's mother not confront this in any way, or did she and I didn't pick it up? If you get what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, I get what you're saying. Do you want? So I think that she doesn't confront him on the page. Whether she confronts him apart, aside from what we see in the book, that's certainly entirely possible. But I think one thing that's important to keep in mind is that gender dynamics in a marriage in the 1950s were, in most cases, pretty different than they are today. Standing up to your husband could get you divorced. It could get you, or it could get you women did not have very many rights in the context of a marriage. This was still a time in which you couldn't get a credit card in your own name. You couldn't get everything was in your husband's name. Everything was owned by your husband, and women were still effectively property, even though we could vote. But that was basically it. So I think that that's an important part of their relationship that goes into it. Like if she had spoken up, the risks for her would have been extremely high. And so that was something she had to take into consideration too.
So, when Linda and Sarah were in the closet together and then Judy saw them having that intimate moment, I know that later Linda didn't tell anybody, and then she let Judy know that it was her fault. And that kind of surprised me because I was thinking that Linda might throw Sarah under the bus and get Judy to be on her side, but that really turned Judy against her because Judy was so freaked out about that kind of stuff. So why do you think, why did she decide to do that?
I think that Linda at that point was still, that was a time in Linda's journey where she was growing a lot and finding out a lot about herself every single day. And I think that part of what she was realizing was that she felt a lot of things for Sarah that she didn't understand. And I think that she wanted to show that, but she didn't really know how. And so in my mind, that was one part of Linda's thinking was, I don't really have many things that I can do to show this girl that I care about her. They weren't even speaking at that time, but this was one thing that she could do in a really subtle way that was within her power to sort of, do something nice for Sarah.
One of my favorite moments in the book is when Linda and Sarah stood up to, was it Bo?
Bo.
And just took him down. How hard do you think that would have been for Linda to do? It was wonderfully done. And she pretty much, that was going to take her life completely out of what, it was going to destroy her life in there. How does she get that courage to join Sarah and take him down so wonderfully?
Yeah. I think still Linda doesn't really have a great sense of what the most logical things are that she can do to move constructively forward, but she's sort of doing what she can. I think that was a sort of spur of the moment decision for her. If she had really sat and thought about that carefully, she might have decided to do something different. But in that moment, that was something that seemed really important to her, and also I think she just really wanted to get this guy. If you've ever had an experience like that where there's somebody who you just really wanted to take down, it can be hard to resist when an opportunity presents itself like that.
Why is it called Lies We Tell Ourselves?
In terms of the title, Lies We Tell Ourselves.
Even though there's multiple plots happening that don't always include the main character.
I'm sorry, could you repeat that last part?
Say it again?
Even though it is two, not separate, but different plots that are affecting the main character differently.
Yes?
So the title for me came from sort of thinking about like where their internal journeys are, and I was thinking about, you know, the ways in which we lie to ourselves about so many different things. In Sarah's case, early on, she's lying to herself when she thinks that she is not strong enough to handle the situation. In fact, she is. There's also, for a lot of us who have, so I'm gay myself, and so I know that for a lot of us who are in the LGBT spectrum, there is often, when you're in the closet, there's a lot of lying to yourself that goes along with that. So I was thinking about that part too. But really just overall, the ways society as a whole will tell ourselves, you know, everything is great and we're treating everybody perfectly fairly and everything is lovely. And then you realize that in fact, that's not true. And so I was writing a story about a very in-your-face case of inequality being demonstrated to folks who previously would have liked to think like, oh, we don't need to worry about this, everything is fine. So that was really the overarching reason that I chose that title.
I personally love the chapter style where each one would have a lie in it, and then it would start to have truths. So, what made you think of that style? Like each chapter having a lie.
If I remember correctly, I actually thought of the title first. And once I had the title, Lies We Tell Ourselves, I thought, well, this would be interesting if I started each chapter off with a lie. Because at that point, I'd already written a few different drafts of it. And so I knew pretty well, like, oh, in this chapter, like, here's what she's thinking. And so that's what contributed to that. And I don't remember now what made me decide to put the truths at the end. I think that was just sort of, once I got to that point, I decided that they weren't really lying to each other as much or to themselves as much anymore. And so I decided to change that up.
I know Mr. Shahanic said that his favorite part was when Linda and Sarah stood up against Bo. What's your favorite part?
My favorite part is when Sarah sings Amazing Grace at the concert. Because I think you like that part too. Because that's like it's basically the only truly like happy moment in the book. And I feel like Sarah deserves happiness, and so I was glad to get to write about her doing something that she actually enjoyed, and hope it came through.
Yeah. So when you were developing the characters and their names and the personalities, did anything from your personal life, like your family members or anything that happened to you, did anything kind of get thrown in there?
I don't think it did with this book. I'm trying to remember if there's anything. I definitely have had, stuff from my life appear in some of my other books, but this book was pretty different. So I don't think there actually is anything from my personal experience in this, aside from the fact that it is set in Virginia and I did grow up in Virginia. It's set in a fictional town towards central Virginia, so it's not super close to where I grew up, but so some of the geography is a little bit inspired by some towns that I have been to in Virginia before.
How long did it take you to like write this whole book?
About a year. It's hard to really quantify because the way usually you do it if you're writing a book that's under contract is you write it and then you sell it to a publisher, and then the publisher asks you to do revisions, and you'll do several different rounds of revisions like that. So it's not done all in one big chunk. But the first draft that I sent to the publishers took about a year to write, and then I spent probably another 6 months after that revising it with publishers.
So I know from the beginning when Sarah and all the other students first came to Jefferson that Judy, she wasn't all that negative towards them. She was actually pretty, I don't want to say kind, but she was kind of kind. So like you didn't really mention much about her family life, but where do you think that came from? Like why was she so like willing to accept them when other people weren't?
So I actually have a whole story for Judy because originally Judy was supposed to be a much more important character than she wound up being. So Judy's background is that and I should specify that this is Judy's background in my mind, because if it didn't make it into the book, then that means it's not actually there, and so you guys can decide whatever you want. But in my mind, Judy lives with a single mom, and it's just been her and her mom all her life, and they're lower class compared to Linda. And she is someone who was never taught to think that she was better than anyone else. And so, and that's what's underlying the racism that Linda and Bo and other characters feel, is that they have been told, oh, you're better than those people. And so Judy has never been told that. And so Judy finds this idea kind of strange, that everyone else at school that she sees anyway seems to think like, oh, well, you know, they're different. And Judy has never had that experience. And so she sort of needs, and so that's part of what's happening to Judy, is that Linda is sort of trying to teach Judy, oh, well, let me explain racism to you. And, you know, but Judy doesn't have that built in the way that a lot of the other characters do. So she's a little bit more resistant to it.
Yeah. I know that the whole, you know, gay relationship kind of thing wasn't, like, nobody was open about that in the 1950s, and maybe this is a reason why, but like, what made you decide to make such a thing the topic of the book?
So that was part of the idea from the very beginning, to have the main character, Sarah, was, I think of her more as bisexual, but she's not straight in any case. And so that was just part of my conception of the character from the very beginning, was that she was dealing with this public issue and then this private issue at the same time. And I don't think I quite understood until I started doing the research exactly to what degree being gay was not talked about in the 1950s, but yeah, it just was not. So as soon as I knew that, and I knew that was part of her character going in, I knew I was going to be dealing with writing an extreme closet situation. There was going to be no question of them coming out at any point. So that was part of it from the beginning.
Could you take us, what's your writing process? How do you go about it? What when you're writing, take us through a day when you're writing your process.
So for a new project, the first thing that I do is I do a lot of brainstorming on the project and thinking about like what the characters are going to be. Usually I start with some sort of kernel, either an idea of a plot or an idea of a character, and I have to expand outward from there. And so I spend a lot of time just brainstorming and thinking through ideas. And then I make an outline, which I actually use Excel to make my outlines. Some writers don't outline their books at all, which I don't know how on earth they do that. Because I just don't know how you know what's going to happen, or how you know that you have enough of a story to fill up a book. But that's the case for a lot of people. And a lot of my friends think that I'm crazy because I outline in as much detail as I do. But so I make an outline in Excel, and then I sit down and start writing the first draft. And that's when I have to sort of tell myself, like, okay, the thing about first drafts is that they're bad, and I have to accept that. I have to realize that whatever I write for this first draft is going to be, I'm going to fix it later. Because there's an expression, writing is rewriting. So I know that when it comes time to revise, that's when I'm going to make the book actually into something that I'm going to be willing to have other people read. So, and that will take a lot of time usually. Sometimes I'll be able to write the first draft of a book in about 6 weeks. But then I know that I'm going to go in and revise, and I'm usually going to spend a lot more time revising than I did writing the first draft. So that's actually what I'm doing right now for one of my next projects, is I'm writing the revision of the book that I already read the first draft of. And the first draft was terrible for this particular book. So I am writing it I basically tossed out the first draft and writing it new from scratch. So for a typical day for me is I'll sit down and I always know what I'm going to do that day. I have a particular scene or a particular chapter that I'm going to be working on. And so I wait until my baby goes to sleep, because I have a baby. She's upstairs taking a nap right now, in fact. And then while she naps, I sit down and write as much as I possibly can until she wakes up. And then I play with her. And then when she goes down for her next nap, I sit and I write down as much as I possibly can again. And it's sort of rinse and repeat.
No. Do we have a sneak peek about what the novel is?
Yeah.
So the next book that I'm working on is it's actually also set in the 1950s. So I've got 4 books out now, and so none of them are set in the 1950s except for Lies We Tell Ourselves, and then this next one, which is going to be my 5th book. So it's called Pulp, and it's about the lesbian pulp fiction phenomenon that happened in the 1950s, which was, there were these books that were published. They were paperbacks, and they were published really cheaply. You could buy them in drugstores for 25 cents. And they were called pulp fiction because they were like falling apart, like the paper was really pulpy. Like you would buy it and you could read it in one sitting, and that was literally all you could do, because then it would fall apart. So usually you would just like throw it in the trash or like leave it on the bus for the next person to read, and then yay for them. But so these books were written, a lot of them were written by lesbian authors, and they were actually written for like a male audience was the idea at the time, but a lot of lesbians read them in secret. And they would have these really scandalous covers because they were, about two women, so they would be, like scandalous, like ladies dressed in red, and sometimes they were like, holding knives because they were also murderers or whatnot. But anyway, so my book that I'm writing is called Pulp, and it's about an 18-year-old girl who is in the process of writing one of these books in 1955. And then it also follows the course of a modern 17-year-old girl in 2017 who finds this book that she published in the 50s and reads it and becomes obsessed with tracking down the woman who wrote it. And so it's about, it follows both of their stories. And it will come out in fall 2018.
Well, we would certainly be willing to read an advanced reader's copy and give reviews before it actually comes out.
You're honored.
I guess so we're running out of time, and I know you probably have to get to your baby, but to me, I sort of got to know you on Twitter, and then I bought your books, and then I've read it. Now I'm going to read more. But you're very much an outspoken advocate for the LGBTQ community. What can we do? What can we do as educators? What can we do with YA Lit and to be advocates ourselves?
So that's a great question. And I think, and I'm talking to you guys here, I think by far the most important thing to do is to talk to the people in your lives about about LGBTQ issues and about LGBTQ people. Because they have proven time and time again, we've made huge leaps in the past decade or so in the LGBT community in terms of acceptance by like mainstream. And so they have proven over and over again that the reason that happened is because people knew other people who either identified as LGBT themselves or who cared about these issues and who cared about people who do. And so by far the most important thing you can do is talk to the people in your community about this and explain to them, especially as anybody who might be resistant, explain to them why it's so important to accept and embrace all kinds of people, including people from marginalized communities, especially LGBTQ folks. So that is number one. And as educators, talking to your students about that same idea, I think is the most important thing.
We are very, very blessed to have had you, and our middle school head, Ms. Wallace, is over here. She sat in.
I snuck in for a second.
And we're just thrilled that to have a chance to talk and sort of pick your brain a little bit more in Washington, D.C. And I hope maybe you'll take a picture with us and all that good stuff. So, but just know that we're going to continue reading your books, and we're going to put our reviews out there and that kind of stuff, and we're going to do our best to be advocates and such. And I just really appreciate your time that you've taken today. And again, you're definitely on my all-time writer list. And please keep doing what you're doing and writing what you're writing. Thank you so much.
Thanks to you guys so much. This is really cool.